tracking the amazing growth of the first century church to challenge and inspire the 21st century church. This is Unstoppable Church, Then and Now, recorded on location in Israel, Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, Malta and Italy. Bible teacher and church pastor Mike Beaumont is in conversation for the next 30 minutes with David Taverner.
As we follow the journey of the 7 churches in Revelation, we've come from Ephesus to Smyrna, to the ruins really of Smyrna in the bustling modern city of Izmir. So I suppose the first question is, how important was this city in the first century?
Oh, very important. I mean, it doesn't look like it would have been, does it, from what's left of it today? But it was very important. A city of about 100,000 people in the time that we are looking at, 35 miles or so north of Ephesus from where we've just come. And it was a city with a history because it had been established by Alexander the Great following a dream that he'd had to establish a city here where there was a good water source. We might even be able to hear the water running in the background there to this day, and to move the citizens from the old town nearby to this. So an important city. It was right on the coast in those days. It was an important harbour city. It's got a bit silted up since then, and the new coast is a little further out. But an important commercial centre on the Aegean Sea, and was a really beautiful city, known as the Crown of Asia and the Flower of Asia in those days.
So it sort of knew its importance.
Yes, it did. It was very, very aware of that and made a lot of that as well, was very proud of it. In fact, it was a city that liked to sort of parade its importance, and it used to love calling itself the first city of Asia in size and beauty, is one of the quotes from the time. And of course, Jesus will pick that up when he addresses this church, reminding them that it's not this city that's the first, it's him that's the first.
As you said, we're in amongst the ruins. I mean, not small site, to be honest, but almost like a park within the big modern city.
Yeah, do you know what? I think that's a great way to sum it up, David, because it really is the size of a park. So compared to Ephesus, where we've just come from, I mean, frankly, it feels rather small, and at first look, it almost looks a little bit disappointing till you dig under the surface. So it is quite small, about the size of, 4 English soccer pitches, something like that. And where we are seated at the moment is in the old Agora. And that's all that's left of the ancient city here. What was the Agora? Well, it wasn't just the marketplace. It was what we've called before the sort of city centre, as it were. So it was a mixture of the administrative centre, the judicial centre, and the economic centre of the city. And we can still see some columns where the stoas, the raised porticos, would have been running all around. It's actually on 2 floors, so we've just been walking down below under some of the beautiful arches. So quite a significant size in that sense because of it being on 2 stories. But in comparison to the ruins at a city like Ephesus, you come here and, to be honest, your first thought is, oh.
I think the challenge, though, of course, for archaeologists is that, here we're in a modern city. So you've got the modern city on top of everything else.
Yes, and it's easy for us to forget that, in fact, that's what's happened throughout history. Cities have been attacked, destroyed, rebuilt again, and they always did it on top of it. And the work of archaeologists is often to dig sort of trenches deep down and to find the different strata, the different level of civilizations below it. And in some places, it's easier to do that than others. But Izmir is a very, very extensive city. It's the 3rd biggest city in modern Turkey after Istanbul and Ankara. And while its official figures are probably high 4-point-something million, they've had a big influx of immigrants who fled from other nations. And really the the figure's probably nearer 6 million people here in this city. So it's a very modern city, and as we look all around us, climbing up the hillside on one side, stretching out on the plain on the other, a modern city's grown up. So somewhere under all of that is the ancient city, but really this is all that's left for us to look at today.
And what links did the ancient city have, for example, with Rome?
Well, it allied itself very closely with Rome. In 195 BC, it had built a temple to the goddess Roma, the personification of Rome itself, and it was the first city ever to do that. In 23 AD, it had built a temple to Caesar Augustus, and then in 25 AD to the Emperor Tiberius. So it really was very, very pro-Roman. In fact, it had been given a particular title, an honorific title. It was called Neokoros. Neokoros meant, well, literally sweeper of the temple servant. But the temple in question here was the emperor, who was starting to see himself as a god in this period of history. And so this city had built temples 3 times to 3 different emperors, so was awarded the title of Neokoros, servant of the temple, the emperor's temple, 3 times, which is more than any other city.
So that was the background to the Christian church here in ancient Smyrna.
Yes, absolutely. Acts 19 verse 10 gives us a little window into what happened. We don't get a great amount of detail about how the church was established here, but Acts 19:10 suggests that the church here was founded during Paul's 3rd missionary journey, when people who had got converted here in Smyrna went back to their hometown in various directions from here, from this harbour town, and took the good news of Jesus with them. So established almost certainly by converts in Ephesus. Now, we do know the church grew here. I mean, we don't know an awful lot about it, but we do know it grew because we get reference in the beginning of the 2nd century to its first bishop, a guy called Polycarp, who's very important because we're told by the church historian Tertullian that Polycarp was one of the Apostle John's disciples.
John received this vision from Jesus.
Exactly. So Polycarp is a direct connection back to John, who'd written both the gospel and who received this vision. And Polycarp will be bishop here. He'll eventually give his life for the Lord here. He will become a martyr. And there's a very famous saying, because the city authorities invite him to recant, to give up his faith, and they would spare his life. And he says, 68 years I have served him, and he has always been faithful to me. Shall I now be faithless to him? Never. And he's ready to yield his life for the Lord Jesus. So clearly, a church got established here and got established well.
Well, let's just turn the clock back a little bit to when John received the vision from Jesus about this Christian community.
Yes, so let's do that. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 8, where we get the second letter to the 7 churches, and it begins exactly like the one at Ephesus did, to the angel of the church in, now Smyrna. Angel, remember, either guardian angel or a representative figure of the leaders of the church. So what does Jesus say? I find it exciting. This is Jesus speaking. This is Jesus bringing a message to his church here.
And in some Bibles, the words of Jesus are in red.
Yes, they are, and it makes it stand out even more. Just want to underline the fact that in the original Bible, of course, no words are ever in red. They're all in exactly the same thing. But it makes it stand out even more. So here we go. These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. For he who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death.
I noticed that the way Jesus describes himself has echoes of how the city here thought of itself.
Oh, yes. You know, every single time in these letters we get a slightly different description of Jesus, don't we? And each one so often echoes the society in which the church was placed. And here that's exactly what happens. Jesus says that he is the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. Now, remember what I said a few minutes ago. The city here prided itself in being first city of Asia in size and beauty. The city loved to think of itself as being first. And Jesus says, no, I'm first. Church, no matter what this city might want to do for you, it does not hold ultimate power. I do. And then he goes on to say a second thing. I am the first and the last who died and who came to life again. Now, that is not only true historically of what happened to Jesus, but he's thinking back there to what happened to this city, because it itself had experienced an incredible resurrection. It had been totally destroyed in 590 BC, but then rebuilt in 290 BC by one of Alexander the Great's generals. And the city was really proud of what it saw as its resurrection, utterly destroyed. But look what we've done. We've brought the city back to life. So Jesus picks up these two things. Your city thinks it's the first. Ha! It's nothing like first compared to me. Your city thinks it's been raised from the dead. Ha! It's nothing like the raising from the dead that I myself have experienced. So he's getting them to focus their eyes not on their culture, not on the pressures that lay around them, but on Jesus, who's firmly seated on his throne.
I was going to say, what does that mean for us today, that Jesus is still the first and the last?
Well, it means that, no matter what wants to come against us, there's always someone higher and bigger and greater. And let's face it, we often find things coming against us, particularly as Christians and often in the workplace these days. But whoever your boss is, whoever it is has told you to shut up, whoever it is has told you to rig those books, whoever it is who's told you whatever, they're not the first. And I think the thing it encourages us with is, don't be frightened of them. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. And this is so much what this letter is full of. We've called this episode Reminded, because the church needed to be reminded in a city where there was pressure to succumb to the society around. Here was a reminder very firmly to fix their eyes on Jesus, who is always the greatest. And so I'd say to anyone today who's facing pressure, difficulties, obstacles, yeah, these things might be very real. I'm not doubting that. But there is one who is greater than them all. So today, stop. Lift your eyes to Jesus. Give the situation to him. Cry out to him. Let him know that you see he is greater than this thing. And sit back and watch what he will do.
This vision to John from Jesus seems to imply that Jesus knew quite a bit about this church in Smyrna. But what in particular is highlighted?
Yeah, he knew what they were going through. And, in passing, I just love that. Jesus knows what we are going through. Let's underline that for our listeners today. Whatever you're going through at the moment, Jesus knows it. And he knows it not in a sort of academic way, oh yeah, I'm aware of that. He knows it deep in his heart. He knows it. He feels it. He's with you in it. You're not alone in it. You're not abandoned in it. He knows it and has provision in it. So he says to them here, I know your afflictions and your poverty. A couple of things there. I know your afflictions. The Greek word there, thlipsis, really means crushing pressure. We don't quite have an English word that sort of communicates that in just one quick word. I know the crushing pressure that you feel you are under. It's as though, you're lying down and someone's found this great heavy stone like these behind us here from the forum, and they've put it on top of you, and the weight of the stone is crushing you.
And that can be a terrible thing to experience today.
It can, and it can be very real, and particularly when it goes on day after day. And sometimes that crushing, it may not be physical, psychological pressure, the constant barrage of opposition that you might get from people at work can feel like this heavy stone on you, crushing you, crushing you, crushing you, until you think, can I breathe anymore? And that's how these Christians here in Smyrna were feeling. But the first thing Jesus says to them is, I know you. I know what you're going through. I understand this. I know your poverty. I don't think he's necessarily talking about financial poverty there, though he may have done. A lot of them may have lost their jobs. They don't have the resources to deal with this situation. But it may have also meant that because some of them were now feeling they couldn't go to the pagan temples where so many of the city's guilds, and it was essential to be part of those to be able to carry on a trade here, could be that those guilds were now closed to them and that people just couldn't get work anymore because they'd become a Christian. So there is huge pressure here, psychological, physical at times, financial, emotional. They are crushed, perhaps boycotted, perhaps ostracized. And yet, what does Jesus say to them? I know what you're like. But actually, do you know what? You're rich. You're rich. Why? Because you know me, you know my Father, you know where you're going in life, you know you have a purpose in life. And maybe for anyone today who's just feeling crushed by weight, can you just stop for a moment and one, remember that Jesus knows, but two, also remember that you've got an inheritance and a destiny. And as Jesus said, you are rich and he's got a plan.
What else does he say he knows?
He says, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Oh my goodness, that's quite strong language, isn't it, here to describe Jews with. He's thinking here of how there were many Jews denouncing Christians to Rome. Now remember, as far as Rome was concerned, initially, Christianity was merely a Jewish sect. And there were dozens of Jewish sects, and for the Romans it was, oh yeah, here's another one. And initially, Christianity was able to operate fairly freely as far as Rome was concerned, because it was part of Judaism and therefore a religio licta, an officially permitted religion. But as soon as Jews started denouncing Christians and going to Rome and saying, here, these Christians, they're not part of us, you know. They are not a Jewish sect. We don't recognize them at all. They're unofficial. They're practicing illegal religion. Well, at that point, of course, Rome begins to get more interested. And so this synagogue of Satan here is a reference to the Jews who were denouncing Christians to Rome as non-Jews, and therefore not exempt like Jews were from offering incense to Caesar. Everyone in the Roman Empire could believe in whatever gods they liked, but by this period, once a year, just once a year, that's all they asked, offer a little pinch of incense in one of Caesar's temples, on his altar, offer a little bit of incense and say, Caesar is Lord, then you can go away and carry on with your life and believe what you want and worship who you like for the rest of the year. But of course, the minute Jews have said Christians aren't part of Judaism, Jews were exempt from doing that, the only group that were, because Rome recognized their staunch belief in the one God. And so now Christians find themselves in trouble, because now they have to offer this pinch of incense once a year and say Caesar is Lord, but they can't. Why? Because Jesus alone is Lord. And so increasingly now, the Christians are going to find themselves facing opposition from Rome on the grounds now of sedition, of treason. And that, of course, is a capital offence.
So essentially what the Jews are saying against the Christians is slander.
Well, that's a good way to put it. It is, isn't it? They are setting someone up by saying some things against them that may have a measure of truth in there somewhere, and did, but also trying to set them up to get them into trouble. And of course, that often still happens with Christians today, isn't it? People set them up. They highlight perhaps one thing that they do believe, forgetting all the other things, and major on that one to portray them in a bad light. And we've seen examples in the UK over recent years, haven't we, where Christians have been set up in a bad light with their employees or with their educational institutions. I think of one where a trainee social worker on his own social media page made a post that was in favour of biblical traditional view of marriage. And some of his student so-called friends saw that, went to the university authorities and slandered this guy and said, this guy is not fit to be trained as a social worker. And at that time, he was thrown off his social work course. Now, that is a type of slander, and Christians are increasingly facing that type of scenario. Now, thank God we have organisations in Britain where people are prepared to stand up and fight for Christians. So things like the Christian Legal Centre, God bless them, are prepared to go and fight the cases of Christians in court and to have such decisions like that overturned. But we're going to find increasingly those sort of things happening in the Christian church. And it's at times like that that we are going to need to be reminded who is number one, who is Lord, who is pulling your strings, if I can put it that way. Are you going to let the world pull your strings? Are you going to let the culture pull your strings? Or are you going to let Jesus pull your strings from heaven?
Despite the pressures that the Christians here in Smyrna were facing, if Jesus was to sort of give the church marks out of 10, how would they score?
Well, I think they do pretty well, because this is one of the very few letters to the churches where there is no rebuke. I mean, some of them, they get commended, but then, my goodness, they don't half get a rebuke. But this church only gets commendation. There's no rebuke. Mm-hmm. So he goes on to say, don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Oh dear, things are going to get worse. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. Oh yeah, they're going to get worse. And you'll suffer persecution for 10 days. Persecution, same word there, thlipsis, the crushing, unbearable pressure. But be faithful even to the point of death, and he will give you the crown of life. So Jesus can't pretend that everything's going to be all right. It is going to get difficult. Some of them are going to end up in jail. And it's worth our remembering that in those times, you only ever got put in jail normally in Roman culture if what was going to follow was the death penalty. So they didn't have like jail sentences like we do today. So they are going to experience a significant amount of pressure coming. It might just be worth our commenting on what he says there, that you're going to be put in prison to be tested, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. This is a good opportunity for me to comment on how numbers are used in Revelation. Revelation is a book that belongs to the genre known as apocalyptic, and it uses imagery and numbers in very well understood ways in those days. We cannot give it our meaning and say, oh, this means that because that's what it means to us. We have to get back and say, what did this mean to them? And so numbers are used again and again in Revelation. And the number 10 was used at this period in Jewish thinking to mean a complete period. 5 meant half a complete period or half a complete number. So in Jesus' parable of the 10 maidens, 5 were wise, 5 were foolish. 10, the total number of people, half were this, half were that. But other numbers are used like that as well.
So it doesn't mean 10 days literally?
Absolutely not. And that's so important to remember when you come up against other numbers in Judaism as well. And some of the big ones, I suppose, are 6 and 7, particularly 6, 6, 6. 6 was the number of humanity, a man. Now, if you wanted to emphasize something in Hebrew, they didn't have a comparative and superlative, so they repeated a number. So you might say good, 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 where we would say good, better, best. So if you want to say something is human, you would say 6. If it's very human, it's 6, 6. If it's absolute, the epitome of humanness, it's 6, 6, 6. So when this opponent to Christ comes up later in this book, what does Jesus show John? Hey, listen, there's going to come this figure who will oppose God and me and his church, but don't worry, his number's only 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. But I'll tell you what, he'll never be a 7 because only God is 7. The same will happen with the number 144,000. That, again, is not a literal number in Revelation. It's a combination number. How can you make up 144,000? Well, 12 was the number of God's people. Why? 12 tribes of Israel. 12 times 12? Oh, absolutely, all God's people. 10, the number of completion. 10 times 10, really complete. 10 times 10 times 10, 1,000. Absolutely complete. So 144,000 is 12 times 12 times 10 times 10 times 10. All of God's people, absolutely all of them, not one of them is missing. So please, don't get into counting when you come to numbers in Revelation. Come to interpreting them in the way that they would have been interpreted at this period of time.
So having explained the number 10 days there, what about the reference in the promise to a second death?
Yeah, a second death. What's he talking about there? Well, the first death is obviously the death that you and I die at the end of this life. What's the second death? We get a glimpse of it at the end of the book of Revelation. It's what happens to us eternally when Christ returns on the day of judgment. And on that day, depending whether our name has been written in the book of life or not, depending whether we have trusted in Christ, will determine whether we spend eternity with God our Father in his new creation, or whether we experience the second death, exclusion from him forever. And those who trust in Christ, those who overcome, as he puts it there, those who hold on faithfully to Jesus despite everything. Hey, don't worry, you'll escape death, both first death and second death. In other words, he is reminding them of the great hope to come. It's the same picture as the previous verse when he promises them the crown of life. A crown there, not like an English king's crown, but the laurel wreath crown that was given to someone who had run a race. Keep running, keep at it, don't give in, despite everything that's going on around you. You just keep on going. And he reminds them there's a reward coming for you at the end of this life.
So as you look around these ruins of ancient Smyrna, it isn't just history we're looking at then, it's something that's totally relevant to today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a reminder to us, I think, that no matter what goes on in society around, no matter how society might see itself, no matter how much society might think that it is God and its values and decisions are the right ones, and sometimes that rebounds on us. Well, Jesus says, stay faithful. I know what you're going through. I'm with you in it. Hang on in there. And whatever it is, you will be victorious. So a reminder here to be faithful, to not give in, to not yield to the values of the culture around us. And, you only have to look back throughout church history to see that when the church hasn't done that, frankly, it's shriveled up and been of no effect. But whenever it has done that, stood firm, held on to Jesus, stood in line with the scriptures, it's then that the church has always been unstoppable church.
Mike Beaumont and David Taverner, travelling from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond to track the amazing growth of the first century church and what that means for the unstoppable church of the 21st century. There are more Bible podcasts from Mike and David on the UCB Player app and major podcast platforms. Check out Jesus Then and Now or Bible Books in 30 Minutes.